And this is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by Op-Ed News, available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Network, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and more. It's also available at opednews.com/podcasts, where you'll get the complete history of over 400 interviews. iTunes has about the last 100. My guest for this show is Glen Ford. He is the Black Agenda Report executive editor. Glen, you describe yourself as a certified elder of the Black journalism tribe on Black Agenda Report, and that's for good reason. You were doing broadcast news in 1970. It's going to be a 50-year anniversary. That's incredible.
Well, that's when I started getting paid. I actually went on the air since my father was a disc jockey back in 1961 when I was 11 years old, although I was not a paid performer.
That's what a history. Wow. Which maybe has some little explanation for the extraordinary voice that you have, both metaphorically and concretely. And you've been the founder or co-founder of numerous programs and projects, including America's Black Forum, Wrap It Up, and Black Commentator. And it's great to have you back. It's been too long since you were on this show.
Thanks for the opportunity.
It's a pleasure. It's an honor and a pleasure, really. You know, I call the show the Bottom Up Show because I think we're transitioning from a predominantly top-down culture to one that is more bottom-up. And for me, bottom-up means, well, most people, when they think of bottom-up, they think of grassroots or wisdom of the crowd or crowdfunding and things like that. But I've come to believe, after doing hundreds and hundreds of interviews and reading a lot about it, that bottom-up is a way of thinking and a way of seeing and a way of relating. For most of human existence before history, humans lived in hunter-gatherer bands, not even tribes, small bands, 30 to 80 people, and they had to depend on each other. They had to take care of each other. They were interdependent and had to be ultimately cooperative. And what we know now is that humans evolved with literally hundreds of genes that predispose people to be more bottom-up in terms of having a kind of a connection consciousness. And I think that the internet and smartphones have catalyzed us to return to a more bottom-up way of thinking and being. And after doing hundreds and hundreds of interviews, I wrote a book, The Bottom-Up Revolution. So I'm always interested in how people have a take on bottom-up and top-down and the different elements that go into it. I think that what happened was when civilization came along, and civilization is a great thing that enables us to do amazing things. But like any new idea or technology, things bite back. And civilization bit back with hierarchy, centralization, authoritarianism, slavery, and some problems that continue to persist over as many as 10,000 years, although for many parts of the world, civilization is only 500 years old. So I just wanted to kind of throw out some of my thinking about it, because hopefully as we have this conversation, you can add some comments on it. Matter of fact,
certainly human beings are social animals. Now, of course, we already have an historical analysis. The name is Marxism. Which explains the rise of various classes and class warfare, and describes capitalism as, in fact, the status in which one class, a very small one, lords it over all of the rest of us under imperialism, when capitalism has stretched its arms, its tentacles all around the world. It is an extremely minuscule number of people who are lording it over billions of folk. And if we are social animals, and we are, then this is a very anti-social arrangement. which we as a species should be rejecting, not just as the class that is under that minuscule group of rulers.
And I believe that the internet and smartphones have catalyzed a kind of a return to bottom up, where young people born after 1980, they see with more bottom up eyes. They see the injustice, and they see that there are problems that gives me hope that maybe things will change.
Yes, except that the mechanisms through which people connect themselves through the internet are controlled by these same oligarchs, this minuscule number, not 1%, but an infinitesimal fraction of a percent, who grow crazily wealthy off of the internet mechanisms that you just spoke of, and increase their political power thereby over the rest of us. So they get wealthier from this conversation that you see so much promise in.
You're right. You're right. I do believe that the platforms that people are using offer both potential and a threat. I was thrilled to see that one of the co-founders of Facebook, Chris Hughes, has called for the breakup of Facebook and has called out Mark Zuckerberg as an extremely dangerous, excessively powerful person. And I think that that's a good sign. And hopefully the voices will be raised to take a look at that and to see these massive platforms, Facebook and Google and Amazon and Apple and Microsoft as platforms that are threats to democracy and forms of, if not monopoly, incredible power that have to be addressed.
Yes, they can be turned into their opposites. They were conceived, or at least marketed, as vehicles through which regular people, the base, could communicate with each other, horizontal communication. But they can be turned into, and are being turned into, vehicles by which the ruling class can more easily indoctrinate as well as surveil the masses of people.
So what would you see as the solution to dealing with these giant platforms?
Well, certainly as corporations, just as lefties, looking at huge corporations with oligopolists at the helm, of course they should be broken up. Those of us who are real socialists would say, no, that breaking up these huge monopolies, just like breaking up the banks, really doesn't solve the problems, because we still have a very small number of people who will collaborate with each other towards a common political end. So we have to consider means of social control over or social ownership of
that. I think is we need to make them parts of the commons.
We have the technology. The technology is truly neutral. How can we use it in a democratic or democratizing fashion? How can we make the technology conform to the social nature of human beings?
I think we need to return those giant social platforms to the commons. I think that the people need to own them, and all the technology and all the patents as well. They violated the trust. They violated agreements. You know, they're talking about fining Facebook $5 billion. That's not enough. They need to kill the corporate identity of Facebook.
Oh, Dean Baker, who's certainly not a socialist, talks about copyrights and patents all the time as a part of the institutional framework of the rule of the rich.
Talk more about that.
Well, when you have a patent or a copyright, that extends your monopoly on a good or a service, including vital services like medicine, for a long period of time. A patent is a monopolistic artifact or instrument. And yet much of the left doesn't talk about patents and copyrights. much. Maybe because little people think that if they can get a copyright on a book, that will advance their purposes. So it's possible that people suffer under the illusion that patents and copyrights are somehow accessible to regular people, and they may be in a small way, but they are huge instruments of monopoly control. That ought to be a real part of the political dialogue, especially when we're talking about healthcare.
Also, when we're talking about world trade agreements, international trade agreements, most of the trade agreements have had major influence from people who are interested in patents and copyrights. And that has been one of the main, I think, impetuses for passing things like TPP and their counterparts.
TPP and NAFTA and all of those agreements, which are not trade agreements, they're corporate governance agreements, as has been pointed out quite often, a way of stitching the world together legally so that capital can effectively dominate. And that's why these agreements are bipartisan. That is, both corporate parties, or the most corporate elements in both parties, are for these trade agreements. Obama was a great champion of these agreements. That's because it's a consensus of the ruling class that this is what they need to rule. And these agreements are put together by corporate lawyers, just as Barack Obama's healthcare plan was put together by drug companies and insurance lawyers.
Yeah, so that was my next thing on my list, two corporate parties. You talk about that. Talk more about the two corporate parties.
Well, I think that everybody who watches your program knows that we have two corporate parties. What's important to further discuss on the left is what this duopoly means in Black America. It has devolved to these two parties, of course, both of them being dominated by capital, but in terms of gaining a political majority for one or the other corporate party, they make racial appeals. And so the Republican Party has been, certainly since 1968, the white man's party in this country. I want to emphasize that there has always been a white man's party in the United States. It's founded as a white settler colony and then a white settler republic. But allegiance to the whiteness of it has always been at the center of politics in the United States. And so there's always been a party that is self-proclaimed whiter than the other party. After the Civil War, the Democrats slimed the Republican Party as being the Black Party. And in fact, in the South, it was the Black Party. So the racial nature of the duopolies, that is one claiming to be the whitest of them all and the other being somewhat more inclusive, is pretty damn permanent in the United States. What we see today is this writ very large, with Donald Trump abandoning the dog whistles, the more polite expression of the white man's party language in the Republican Party, and feeding white folks red meat, screaming about Mexican racists. And of course, there's always the subtext of anti-Blackness in that conversation. And when you have only two parties,
Wait. Start over. When we have, it just broke up.
We have effectively two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, a duopoly system. And one of those parties is the white man's party. And that means that Black folks have only one party. The Black America becomes effectively a one-party state. And so the Democratic Party is much more than a party that Black people go to vote for because it's the only one of the duopoly parties that they could possibly vote for. It has infiltrated, permeated all of the civic institutions of Black America, so that the NAACP becomes, certainly every election cycle, but most of the rest of the year as well, an annex of the Democratic Party. And the Urban League acts the same. But most of our churches also become annexes of the Democratic Party, as well as the fraternities and sororities. Kamala Harris, when she made her announcement, she did it in the bosom of the biggest Black sorority in the country, of which she is a member. Because the Democratic Party politics is infused in all of these institutions. That's what happens when you have a one-party state. So theoretically, white folks can vote Democratic or Republican, but not Black people, because the Republican Party is the white man's party. And that causes great distortions in the Black polity. Black people are, and by any measurement, to the left of white America. In fact, I maintain that there is a separate Black political spectrum, and that you shouldn't compare Black conservatives and white conservatives. There is no comparison between self-proclaimed Black liberals and white liberals. That in fact, Black self-declared conservatives are on the issues to the left of most white liberals. So it's a separate polity and a very left polity. But it's forced into this one-party state democratic, at voting times, situation in which the primary goal of the Black voter, especially if we're talking about national primaries like the season that we're approaching now, the principal aim of the Black voter is to elect a Democratic candidate who can beat the white man's party. And that means that folks are supporting candidates not based upon the issues, whether that Democratic candidate agrees with them on healthcare, on war and peace, on the criminal justice system, but choosing that candidate largely based upon whether they believe that he or she can beat the white man's party candidate, this time around Trump. That distorts Black politics. It makes people vote for people who are way to the right of them, because the main aim is just to beat the white man's candidate, the white man's party's candidate.
And it seems like the Black vote tends to be a lot more conservative.
It is not conservative. It is voting for the candidate they believe can beat the Republican. That is a crucial difference. If you look at the surveys, and it's been conclusive over the years, Black folks, especially on bread and butter issues, but also quite dramatically on war and peace issues, are demonstrably to the left of white people. But when the primary time comes, they tend to vote for the candidate they think is strongest. And the strongest candidate is almost always the one with the biggest corporate funding.
Ouch, 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 ouch.
And that's where the vote goes if the primary goal, if the overarching reason for voting is to beat the dreaded white man's party, who are an existential threat to the Black community, then that's what you do. So this is a great distortion, and it's why Black leftists have an overarching interest in the breakup of the Democratic Party. As long as there is this duopoly, and Black people are forced into it's Trump versus anybody, the best we can get from the Democrats, then this distorts and suppresses the radical tendencies that exist in Black America.
And what about the Progressive Caucus and the Black Caucus within Congress?
The Black Caucus has not lived up to its motto of the conscience of the Congress for the entirety of the 21st century. In fact, the two magazines that I co-founded, Black Commentator in 2002 and Black Agenda Report, have dedicated a great deal of our efforts to documenting the slide into oblivion and irrelevance of the Congressional Black Caucus. The caucus used to operate on consensus. I'm talking about before the turn of the 21st century. And because it was essentially a group of left politicians, that is, on the left of the Democratic spectrum, as well as the entire congressional spectrum, and consistently so, it was rather easy to get consensus on some basic social issues, the necessity to deepen and broaden the social safety net, and the imperative for peace. The Congressional Black Caucus members were basically in agreement on that, and they could operate on consensus, and they would issue statements that were progressive. But after 2002, and that was the most important year in terms of what the caucus has become. After 2002, we saw a breakup of the left or left liberal consensus in the Congressional Black Caucus, and it has issued no statements as a body on any seminal issue since then. What happened in 2002 was the entrance of corporate capital with all 4 feet into ghetto politics, into Black Democratic congressional politics. Big corporate capital had not messed with that arena before. So the Republicans had basically stayed away from it as well. But after 2002, and this is the year that Cynthia McKinney was diselected from her Atlanta district, Earl Hilliard, another progressive Black congressman in Alabama, in the Black Belt of Alabama, he was also tossed out. And Cory Booker, in his first run for mayor in Newark, New Jersey, almost won. Cory Booker was a candidate of right-wing corporate dollars. He was just a first-term New York City councilman of no real stature in terms of that city council, and was not head of any block, but he had made some very important corporate connections. In 2002, when he made his first run for mayor, his coming out event was a power lunch at the Manhattan Institute. You, I'm sure, are aware of the Manhattan Institute as being part of that constellation of right-wing think tanks with a special responsibility in that right-wing think tank division of labor in media, because it's in Manhattan. And if you are the star of a Manhattan Institute power luncheon, that is one part of the right-wing constellation telling the whole network, this guy is one of ours.
It's kind of like it's kind of like Joe Biden doing his first campaign event at a Comcast.
That's right. Then everybody knows, corporate guys, this is our guy. Support him. The same thing with Cory Booker in 2002. But because Black folks don't speak that language, don't hang around in those circles, and that's a very good thing. But that also means that we didn't understand, or most folks didn't understand. We at Black Commentator understood very well what was happening. But even Booker's opponent, Sharp James, the incumbent mayor, had no idea where Cory Booker was getting these millions of dollars to challenge him. Sharp James was the most powerful Black politician in Newark. He thought he had the support of the local business class, but he didn't understand the right-wing network, and he didn't understand what it means to run against real political corporate money on a national scale. And so these millions of dollars poured into Cory Booker's campaign. He almost won the mayorship on his first run, but we turned him back barely.
So we're going to have to talk about how you deal with millions of dollars in corporate money. But first, I need to do a brief show ID. And for the video, just going to pause so that when I do the audio part, it's because it's on the radio for Pacifica Radio, I can edit out and put in a bumper.
Gotcha.
And my guest for this show is Black Agenda Report executive editor Glen Ford, a certified elder of the Black journalism tribe, as he's described, going into 50 years of actually being a paid journalist. It's fantastic.
And sometimes unpaid.
And sometimes, yeah, you know about that. So we were talking about Cory Booker and how Cory Booker jumped into a mayor's race with millions in corporate money. We're seeing that now. We're seeing the same thing happening in the primaries for the 2020 elections. What do we do? How do we stand up to that? How do we stand up to the fear that people are basing their decisions on right now? The fear that's leading them to pick somebody who they think is the most likely to win, even though he or she is corporate.
Well, that always is the quandary. We know that you defeat corporate power and money power with people power, and that's easy to say, but you got to get all those bodies together to show not only the people in power that you have people power, but to show the people that they have power. And often just getting those bodies together to demonstrate people power, it costs a little bit of money too.
Yeah.
What we saw, for example, with Bernie Sanders' run in 2016, which was really an education, I think, for all involved to see, where the corporate media tried its best to ignore Bernie and his Medicare for All call. But the crowds kept on coming. Those young people kept on packing his speeches, 10,000, 20,000, sometimes even more than that, so that they could not be ignored by the corporate media. And so it's in terms of its national profile, it started off very slow because the corporate media deliberately tried to bury it. But people power, folks just going to his rallies made it impossible to ignore. So that's an example on a very elementary level of people power. But I'm sure that those folks wound up at those rallies in such large numbers because of use of the social media, that there was organizing behind it.
And now what we're seeing now is we've got these polls showing huge advantages for Joe Biden now that he's entered the race. And we've at opednews.com, we've got a poll analyst, Jerry Polikoff, who's been looking at those polls. And what they're doing is they're looking at likely voters. And the way you define a likely voter can be somebody who voted in the last two presidential elections or the last 6 years of elections. That leaves out the young people.
That's right. And they're also still using landlines. And they haven't figured out how to do a poll in a world in which there are at least 2 generations of people who don't use landlines and don't even know what those machines look like.
I would say they figured it out and they're doing it because it works for them, because it makes people feel like Joe Biden's got more momentum than he really has.
And when you know that the results that you tabulate are based on rigged ways of counting, then you are rigging the polls. And I looked at those Biden numbers And I was absolutely certain that these are effectively rigged polls. They're part of the psychological operation. And it is that kind of rigging of the poll certainly works on black folks, because black people care most of all about beating the white man's party. And if you keep on piling up those fictitious numbers for Biden, they'll be convinced that that's the way they have to go, even though the black policy is to the left of Bernie Sanders.
You know, I don't want to fall into the trap of just talking about regular politics, because you've got such a vision for seeing the world outside of politics and in different ways. So I would like to hear from you about your view of where we are today, not necessarily from Democrats and Republican politics, but where the world is and how people are now.
Well, one thing is quite clear, and it becomes more dramatically clear with every day. It becomes more starkly evident under Trump, although the same objective situation existed before Trump. But Trump's very presence has a way of putting things in focus because he's such a caricature. But sometimes caricatures make you think more clearly. At this stage in the decline of capitalism, but specifically the decline of U.S. Imperialism, the United States is actually working against the productive forces of the world, and now acting in ways that can be characterized as waging a war against the rest of the world. The rise of not only China, but East Asia as the economic center of the world, which is today a fact. In terms of that region, we have to include Japan, of course, in that. That is where the things that the world makes are made. It's the center of the world. A Martian in orbit around the Earth would be reporting back home that he's now above the center of this planet, and he'd be somewhere over East Asia. And the US as an empire, a late stage empire, is desperately trying to shift the actual weight of the world to its side of the globe. And to do so, it has to suppress the actual productive forces of the world, which are centered lopsidedly in East Asia. So here we have the latest example of the United States trying to sabotage Huawei, the Chinese electronics company, not because Huawei is a vector of Chinese spying, that the United States knows how to counter-spy. It is the best in the world at it. But because Huawei is technologically in the lead on 5G communications. And because Europe wants what Huawei has. And so does the rest of the world want what Huawei has. So the United States is against technological innovation because it does not control it. It's, you see, and we can look, in fact, at all of these innovations, many of them coming from the Chinese. The Chinese Silk Road approach to trade, the connectivity, connecting the Eurasian landmass, but also connecting Africa to the markets that want to buy whatever Africa has to offer. All of this is a good thing, one would think, for those who speak of the interdependence of the world and integrating all of human family in one system. That's what the capitalists talk about all the time. But if all the roads lead to China, because China is the center of world economic activity, then, well, that's not palatable. It's an existential threat to the empire. So the United States uses its artificial position at the center of the world monetary apparatus in order to sabotage anyone who does not go along with the imperial program effectively, and now toying with its sanctions against Iran, with its strangulation of Venezuela, with its constant war talk, with its tariffs and disruptive tactics against China. It is actually coming close to upsetting causing an economic crisis in the world. Certainly, it's put a damper on investment.
And you wrote in a very recent article, the U.S. has been eclipsed in every sphere but war. And it makes me think, I think you're right. And I think that the manufacturing has shifted to East Asia and Japan and Korea and China and even others. And where does that leave the United States? And how do the American people's lives change because of that?
It's a crisis that the capitalists created for themselves. Somehow they imagined, as they shifted their supply lines to the south and the east, to the lowest wage markets that they could find or create. They keep on trying to force Haiti into being at the bottom of the wage barrel, as much as Haiti tries to climb out of that imposed situation. But somehow these finance capitalists imagined that with their military power, and I also think that they're racist who think that they're smarter than the rest of the world, but they imagined that somehow on their financial capitalist mountain in London and New York, that they could control this global imperial enterprise, even as the productive centers of the world, with their help, of course, was shifting to the south and the east. They created this contradiction, and as they were doing it, I was 30 years old in 1980. I'm watching the beginnings of this happening and saying, don't they know that they are empowering what used to be called the third world? That we saw the contradiction as it was created by them. Well, now it's insurmountable. China's rise is a fact, and the magnetic pull of that new center of the world, which used to be the center of the world, certainly before Christopher Columbus and the other European depredations of post-1492. In a way, China is just resuming its historical position.
We do go through cycles, don't we?
With a whole bunch of drama in between.
Yeah. So what does that mean for Americans, though? You've got the power that's shifted to the east. How do our lives change, and how do we address it? How do we, on the left, look at this and find opportunities and possibilities and hope?
Well, for the people in the rich capitalist countries, the United States, Europe, and Japan, the question is, the immediate question is, how do you break out of the capitalist ruling classes consensus position, which is never-ending austerity? The ruling class offers only two things. It has agreed on only two things amongst itself, and it enforces these two things through its electoral mechanisms. And those two things are austerity, never-ending, and war, never-ending. So how, in terms of domestic politics, do you break that consensus by the rulers in both parties, in the Democratic and Republican parties, that you are not going to have any more people's programs. You're not going to be able to turn to your own government to cushion the blows that the corporations in their creative destruction are hitting you with. You're not going to have any, certainly nothing innovative, and not even a revival of the old social mechanisms like cash welfare, for example, to cushion the blow as unemployment based on automation carves its way through the ranks of the working class. We have to break that. And I think, and it's going to sound to some of your viewers like I'm a Bernie supporter. I think that the Bernie Sanders campaign is extremely important, although we at Black Agenda Report will never be Democrats. But it's extremely important because in calling for Medicare for All, which is a supermajority supported program, as is his platform on free colleges, and as is a $15 minimum wage. In campaigning based upon these supermajorities, it's forcing the Democratic corporate leadership to resist supermajorities of its own base. That is, more than 85% of Democrats support Medicare for all. A similar number support free college. A similar number support what they have heard about the Green New Deal. And virtually all Democrats support a $15 or higher minimum wage. And so Bernie has now created a situation in which the corporate servants of the Democratic Party, like Pelosi, like Schumer, now have to align themselves quite publicly against the wishes of supermajorities of the people. And this exposes and heightens the contradiction within the Democratic Party. We hope that the result is a breakup of the Democratic Party, or at least an exodus of some millions of Democrats who finally realize that they can't change that party.
Hold on. We've got to do another show ID. We can just give it 10 seconds for the video. My guest for the show is Black Agenda Report Executive Editor Glen Ford, who has been doing media for going on over 50 years. So you were saying that Black Agenda Report, you don't support the Democrats, and you're hoping to see a breakup with maybe millions of people leaving it. What would that look like if that happens in the middle of the general election?
Yeah, you know, in one's wildest fantasies, there's a total breakup of the Democratic Party, and the Pelosi's and Schumers take their millions and form some kind of rump party of the middle, and leave all that political space, that social democratic space where almost all Black people are, leave it out there so that Black political organizations and all kinds of new forces could find ways to organize. That would be ideal, but I don't think that's the way it's going to happen. I think that what's going to happen is the Democrats will pull out all the stops. If we thought that they were dirty in 2016, watch them now, including rigged polls, as we just talked about. They'll be both more sophisticated and more crude than in 2016, because Bernie is actually much stronger. And he's got Warren out there churning up some other forces that are really antithetical to corporate rule. And so I think that the corporate rulers of the Democratic Party will really show their hands and their behinds this time in ways that cause some millions of Democrats on the left to forsake that party. And because the left is so weak in the United States, and you can see it in that we don't really have anything that could call itself an anti-war movement. We have some very brave and hardworking people who are still doing anti-war work, but it's not a mass movement.
Who mention a few of the people? Who do you list as the people doing that work for anti-war?
UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition, is doing yo person's work, but it's difficult for them to turn out 10,000 people. That would be a hell of a day if that happened. The Answer Coalition, which was able to turn out hundreds of thousands in the run-up to the Iraq War, now has great problems turning out 4 figures worth of people. But those organizers are still there. They're still working hard. But no, we don't have an anti-war movement.
Well, what about AOC?
The country is waging more wars than in 2003.
I mean, what about AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez?
What about AOC? That's an open-ended question. I'd rather you ask me a more pointed question on it.
Where does she fit into?
I'm glad she's there. I like to see any kind of insurgency in that corporate edifice. But we have to watch her closely. We have to watch all of them closely and try. Sometimes shaming has an effect on people who do believe that they are leftists. That means that they are still capable of being shamed if they're called out by other leftists. That's the only thing that we can do. And so, yeah, we watch them. We're not Democrats, remember. And that is probably is the most useful purpose that we can serve to Democratic insurgents, is to be outside saying, what did you just say about Maduro? You're echoing Trump's line. I thought you said you were part of the Trump resistance, but you're down with Trump on Venezuela. You're sounding like Trump on Iran, even though you say you're against the U.S. pulling out of the treaty, but you're vilifying the government in Iran, and that sounds very much like Trump. So I don't know what kind of role you expect us to play with AOC and the rest of these leftish.
Well, my next question was going to be, what gives you hope?
I already told you that. I see Pelosi made clear what her attitude is towards a Green New Deal. She's not having it. She's going to put every institutional obstacle in the way of the Green New Deal. On top of that, she's going to dismiss it and diminish it arrogantly to let everyone know that she does not respect the people who are pushing a Green New Deal. Now, if AOC thinks that she can convert a party like that, an apparatus like that, into a progressive instrument, well, then she can keep on trucking, and we'll cheer her on. But I don't think that you can keep that up very long without inuring yourself to the evil of the environment that you're working in and slowly becoming part of it.
I didn't hear any hope. What gives you hope? Come on, there's got to be something.
I'm not looking for any kind of change in the Democratic Party.
I'm not talking about the Democratic Party. In the world, in today, in any aspect of it, are there signs of hope that you see, and how can we nourish them and support them?
I want to see the steady diminution of U.S. empire. Every decent person in the world every decent person in the world should be wishing and working for a day when this unholy alliance of these white settler states, the Five Eyes, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, and Britain, and all the former colonial masters of Europe can band together in the most formidable military alliance ever seen, NATO, and threaten the rest of the world. We should be happy with every indication that alliance, that historical reactionary and racist alliance, is weakening. And I think objectively that it is. So I do have hope, but that does not. The weakening of U.S. imperialism can also be accompanied by growing reaction here at home. Hoping.
I've always liked Buckminster Fuller saying that the way you get rid of a bad system is not to fight it, but to replace it.
Well, of course.
So what do you see?
Well, when you, depends on what you mean when you say fight. The AOC thinks that she's fighting the system but she's inside that system, and her stated goal, all of them, is to remake the Democratic Party. Does that mean kicking out the Pelosi's? I think it of necessity does, but I think that AOC and the rest think that they can coexist with the Pelosi's, and I believe that the Pelosi's have been given an assignment from the people they actually work for. Remember, Pelosi is the House Speaker because she gets the most money from the corporations. That is how you qualify to be House Speaker. And I believe that Pelosi's, if AOC thinks that at some point in the future, she and Pelosi and Schumer and the rest of these corporate servants can coexist in the Democratic Party, I think she's wrong, because Pelosi and the rest of them have gotten their assignments from the people they work for. They work for the corporations. Pelosi is the House Speaker because she can gather the most corporate contributions in the millions and then distribute them throughout the Democratic Party caucus. That's why she is who she is, because she is tapped in and a servant of the corporations. And they've told her that no, they're not going to coexist with these people talking about a Green New Deal that would require a kind of command capitalism, and capitalists don't take commands.
So what would you see AOC and Omar and Tlaib, that whole crew that just came in, replacing corporate incumbents? I mean, I think their hearts are in the right place. What would you like to see them do to make a bigger difference, the best difference they can?
You see, I am not criticizing what they're doing. I'm glad they're doing what they're doing. I'm glad and I'm delighted that the corporate media has to pay them attention and give them more exposure. Surprised and delighted that they do that. So I hope that millions of young people get agitated and motivated to work for Green New Deals and for peace and for all of these other causes. But the Democratic Party cannot live with that. Not for long. They've got to stop it. They can't live with Medicare for all, which would only introduce the United States into the global community of capitalist nations that have single-payer health care. And yet that's too much for Pelosi's bosses. And they banded together to beat Bernie this time around by hook or crook. It's the intransigence of U.S. corporate capital as it exists in the Democratic Party as well as the Republicans that guarantees we're going to have some kind of huge trauma in that half of the duopoly.
So to wrap up, we've got about 5 minutes left. what do you have to say that keeps you from getting airtime on mainstream media? What is the message that is the strongest, most powerful message that you have that is the most controversial? I want to make sure that you get it out here.
You know, I used to be on what you call mainstream media. That is certainly on the black side of mainstream media, black radio. Back when I was working in radio, reached 90% of black households. I was always on the #1 station when working locally in the city. When I was at the Mutual Black Network, that was the largest black network with 80 affiliates, reaching well more than half of the black population. So in terms of black America, that was the mainstream. And we could talk about racist South Africa. We could talk about liberation movements because the black community is to the left and is anti-war and is basically anti-imperialist. And that is quite acceptable speech in mainstream black America. The problem was that news became extinct on black radio, black commercial radio, just as it has become extinct on most stations that are white. It's part of the way capitalism has been working here. I don't even attempt to break into mainstream, as you say, corporate media circles now, because no, what we say is absolutely incompatible with the corporate narrative. And the corporate narrative is more and more pure lies, not just propaganda influence news, but pure propaganda built on a basis of lies. You cannot explain U.S. policy in Syria on corporate media.
You wrote an article recently.
To end.
You wrote an article recently. Disinformation is the only language the U.S. empire speaks.
Yes, you have to tell a whole lie rather than a lie accented truth in order to explain U.S. policy. From 2011 on, the United States policy in Syria and Libya was to deploy Al-Qaeda, pure and simple. But how can corporate media, who were aware of it, if I was aware of it and you were aware of it, certainly the practitioners of corporate media were aware of it. But you couldn't speak that truth. To speak that truth, it would be a heresy that would make the listener have to rethink everything that he believed about the mission of the United States. How could the United States now be not just allied with, but training and protecting and arming the same people who are blamed for 9/11? That's just unthinkable. And since it's unthinkable, it becomes unspeakable. And every element of corporate media coverage thereafter in Syria and in Libya was based on a lie. And
we need to wrap up now. Any last words?
I don't want to say any last words, brother. That sounds like a rest in peace. And I'm not.
No.
My own.
You're a valuable voice, and I really appreciate you being on the show. Thank you. This has been Glen Ford. He's the executive editor of the Black Agenda Report. It's been great to have you back. Thank you, Glen.
Thanks for allowing me to ramble on.
No, it's a pleasure.